for a little while. I was in California for 7 weeks. I'm getting a lot of feedback. And thought that I might be talking to you in Pacific time, but I'm not. I had coffee just before we started tonight. And although it's about 10:20, I think I'm in good shape to get through this talk. I look forward to some give and take with you at the end of it. And I hope it will be lively. This is a very different venue than the Pasadena Library, which is where I spoke to you last time. That's such a beautiful building. What I'm going to do tonight is just talk about my new book, or not brand new now, it's about 4 months old, titled The Enduring Civil War, which LSU Press published, and which consists of several dozen short essays that I've written over the last many years for Civil War times. So I just want to give you an inside look of sorts at why and how I put this book together, and give you some sense of what it does. It grew out of an invitation in the summer of 2008 to contribute a 1,000-word essay to every issue of Civil War Times. Dana Shope had recently been named editor, and he said I could write about anything I wanted to write about. He put absolutely no restrictions on what the topics would be. He said the only restriction is that it could only be 1,000 words long. And I generally abided by that, although some of them ran over just a little bit. And some of the versions that are in this book, I expanded considerably. Not many, most of them are short. This idea appealed to me. It really let me have an opportunity to sort of step back and just talk about the state of the field of Civil War studies, which is the field I've been in for virtually my entire life. I became a little Civil War nerd very early on, and have been in this rut ever since. I knew the magazine well. I knew it had been established in 1962. I knew it reached the largest popular audience in the field. Been part of my life since I subscribed to it in 1965 as a 14-year-old in Colorado who was already captivated by the Civil War. I published my very first article in Civil War Times, then called Civil War Times Illustrated, on Abraham Lincoln and black colonization. That was, that was 40 years ago. And I subsequently contributed several more pieces to it. I knew that a number of prominent historians had always written for Civil War Times, including academics, Bell Wiley, T. Harry Williams, Mary Elizabeth Massey, and other academics, as well as authors who reached a very large popular audience, Bruce Catton, Stephen Sears, Glenn Tucker, and others. So I accepted Dana's invitation, and the first essay appeared in April 2009. More than 75 others have followed. Virtually all of them are in this book titled The Enduring Civil War. Walt Whitman comes to mind as I look back on the experience of writing these essays, 6 of them a year. The magazine comes out every other month, as many of you know. In Specimen Days, the poet famously predicted that, quote, the real war will never get into the books. We've all seen that quotation innumerable times. By that, Whitman meant the real story of the common soldiers, the, quote, actual soldier of 62 to 65, north and south, as he explained. The seething hell and the black infernal background of countless minor scenes and interiors, he suggested, will never be written, perhaps must not and should not be. Well, historians and other writers for a long time have taken Whitman's observations as inspiration to find a novel way into a crowded and popular field, and to try to illuminate what they consider neglected or ignored aspects of the war, some of those dark interiors, the things that no one had ever written about. Well, I approached writing the essays convinced that, in fact, a great deal of the real war has gotten into the books. Gifted historians have produced a corpus of scholarship on the Civil War era that, together with the mass of testimony bequeathed by participants, provides readers with bountiful options of ways to come at the conflict. For many decades, historians dealt primarily with 3 things. They dealt with the war's causation, they dealt with high politics, and they dealt with conventional military operations. And those 3 topics remain essential to anyone who's seeking to have a basic familiarity with the whole subject. Over the past half century, as everyone here tonight knows, the literature has become much richer and more expansive. We know far more than previously about Whitman's common soldiers, about women in the United States and the Confederacy, about African Americans in the process of emancipation, about white Unionists and other dissenters in the Confederacy, about guerrilla operations, about the war in a global context, and increasingly about the American West as part of the war's overall mosaic. Scholars also have accorded considerable attention to the so-called dark side of the conflict, to its brutality, atrocities, cowardice, vicious activity by irregular bands, and the physical and psychological wounds that left some veterans profoundly damaged. As the field of Civil War era history has become increasingly complex, there's been an understandable tendency to place a new subject as close as possible to the center of the entire story, and to question many long accepted analytical frameworks. The traditional juxtapositions of North versus South, of slaveholder versus non-slaveholder, of United States versus the Confederacy have come into question, as has the 4-year time frame that typically delineates the subject in the popular imagination. A number of scholars insist that the war, post-Appomattox events such as including Reconstruction, the West and Native Americans, and the world must be brought together to create what is called a long Civil War, far more inclusive and geographically varied than the one dominated by events that transpired east of the Mississippi River, and especially in Virginia, between 1861 and 1865. So we have this kind of traditional war and then this much more expansive new war. And within those two formulations, there's a lot of movement in terms of putting the focus on different aspects of the conflict. From the beginning, I wanted the essays that are now in the enduring Civil War to explore tensions between parts of the recent literature that cover peripheral or secondary dimensions of the conflict, and what I would call 4 foundational elements of the real war. I'll continue with Whitman's phrasing, but not using his narrow meaning regarding common soldiers. I mean the real war, the war as it actually played out. Some new writings, however useful and praiseworthy, obscure realities, in my view, that stand out clearly in the historical evidence and should be as apparent to us as they were to the wartime generation. Evidence highlights these 4 things that I believe are essential to understanding the Civil War. First, the real war erupted over slavery-related political issues between North and South, and the war retained that internal focus. It is not primarily a world event, it is primarily an American event. Second, conventional armies decided the war's outcome, fielding millions of citizen soldiers who waged some of the most famous and costly campaigns in American history. Third, the war ended in the early summer of 1865, having settled the issue of secession's constitutionality and destroyed the institution of slavery, but having left the question of equal rights for freed people unresolved. And fourth, the 12 years of Reconstruction functioned as a long coda to the war itself, again centered on a clear central issue, namely what price 10 former Confederate states would pay to return to the reconstituted Union, and how that would affect African American political rights and economic circumstances. 10, not 11 states, because Tennessee essentially avoided Reconstruction. Anyone who grasps these 4 things has made a very good start toward gaining a general understanding of the real war. Writing the essays allowed me to place our contemporary understanding of the Civil War, both academic and popular, in conversation with testimony from people in the United States and in the Confederacy who lived the war and observed it and described it. Put another way, I could investigate how mid-19th century perceptions align with or deviate from some of those we now hold regarding the origins, conduct, and aftermath of the war. I hasten to make clear that our perspective and access to a plethora of sources can reveal patterns and produce insights not apparent to the wartime generation. Still, SH to discuss how a predilection for reading the past through the prism of our own experience often slights central themes. that emerge clearly from the historical record. One example of that would be now, I mean, we're very focused on race now in our culture. A war for emancipation makes sense to us. It makes sense that the United States would wage a war for emancipation against the Confederacy. And it's easy for us to overlook union. What that obscures is that in the mid-19th century, union far outweighed emancipation as a motivation for the Northern public, the loyal public, I should say, during the Civil War. I'm not talking about causation. I'm talking about motivation during the war. This predilection for things we're interested now can also lead to making some things seem typical that in fact were atypical, and I'll use damaged veterans as an example there. There undoubtedly were many, many thousands of damaged veterans from the Civil War, but I believe that that experience, especially if we're talking about men who had lost a limb, those were atypical, not typical experiences. Hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers essentially never saw combat during the Civil War. So it's a stretch to pretend that they were suffering after the war for some kind of equivalent of PTSD now. So I think we need to be careful in looking back at the past and trying to set some of our concerns and preoccupations, to overlay those over the past and then draw conclusions. Above all, my essays that are now in the enduring Civil War afforded an opportunity to bridge the gap between the academic and popular worlds of Civil War interest. My entire career, I've kind of had one foot in academia. I've had academic appointments, but I've also had one foot in non-academic things related to the Civil War, whether it's battlefield preservation or giving battlefield tours or working with museums. I've always had a sort of academic and non-academic side to what I've done. And what I wanted to do was bring those two worlds together in these essays I wrote for Civil War Times and put them in conversation with one another as well. I believe historians, professional historians, should find ways to share the insights of current scholarship with an interested lay audience. And there's a very large lay audience for the Civil War. I look at the number up here, there are 85 of you tuned in now. Most topics wouldn't get 85 people to tune in for something, to hear somebody just talk at them for this long. Non-professional readers gravitate toward the war's celebrated generals and battles. Something, and the people who lived the war would understand this. They understood the centrality of military events as the war unfolded. Nobody spoke to it better than Abraham Lincoln. In his second inaugural address, he affirmed that, quote, "The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself. And it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all." That's not the part of the second inaugural, the greatest speech any president has ever given by far, that is usually quoted. Usually quote the parts relating to slavery at the end. This is in the beginning, and Lincoln, he didn't focus on this for a long time because he knew everybody knew it. As he said, "It's as well known to you as to myself." Harper's Weekly, the leading illustrated newspaper in the loyal states, similarly reinforced the centrality of military affairs by devoting approximately 80% of its front pages and front page illustrations between April 1861 and April 1865 to battles, military officers, and other martial subjects. Academic historians, now as in the past, much prefer to write about non-military aspects of the conflict. I see no inherent tension between pursuing conventional military topics and appreciating the political, social, and memorial contexts of battles and campaigns. Indeed, any approach that fails to highlight the many ways in which the military and non-military spheres intersected and affected one another promotes a deeply flawed understanding of the whole war. Campaigns had consequences. The 7 days is a fascinating military campaign to study. To see the emergence of Lee, to see the failure of McClellan, to see by far the bloodiest battle in United States history to that point, and the second bloodiest in the whole Civil War play out, is interesting to follow the maneuverings. But what is just as interesting is to see how profoundly the outcome of the 7 days influenced the progress of emancipation. It's not Antietam that's the key battle. For the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the 7 days. It's the 7 days that convinced Lincoln. It's McClellan's failure in the 7 days that convinced Lincoln on the 22nd of July to tell his cabinet he was going to issue a proclamation of emancipation. A few days before that, Congress had passed the Second Confiscation Act, which attacked slavery in the Confederacy. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts directly tied McClellan's failure at the 7 days to passage of the Second Confiscation Act. So yes, the 7 days is a fascinating military event, but it also had tremendous consequences beyond the battlefield, and it's important to bring those two things together. Atlanta, I won't give more examples. I'll give one more. Atlanta. Lincoln wouldn't have been reelected without Atlanta in 1864. So again, tremendous consequences flowing from a conventional military operation. These two spheres of the war, in my experience, often remain quite pushed apart when we look at the academic and the lay worlds of Civil War history. They're largely insulated from one another. A number of my colleagues and friends in academia would disagree with me about that, but I'm going to stick to my guns here. I really see a deep divide between these two worlds. Lay readers typically avoid jargon-filled academic studies. I wish I could avoid them. I mean, it's a misery to read them, but anyway, most people who don't have to read them avoid them. Studies that appeal to a limited professional audience, while academics often deplore the kind of military narratives and biographies that achieve commercial success and garner reviews in major newspapers and other outlets. Attitudes toward interpreting battlefields illuminate divisions in the field as well. As someone engaged in historic preservation at Civil War sites since the late 1980s, I've spoken with an array of people about whether such places deserve protection. My activities related to battlefields have left no doubt to me that Civil War buffs, a dismissive term in academic circles, typically visit such sites to follow the movements of troops and ponder questions about leadership in the crucible of combat. At Gettysburg, they congregate at large numbers Little Round Top to see where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine deployed on July 2nd, or at the Angle on Cemetery Ridge, where fragments of George E. Pickett's division struck units in Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps the next day. These kinds of visits and activities on battlefields confirm the value of examining terrain to appreciate tactical ebb and flow, but they also can serve as a bridge that somehow links our world to that of the Civil War generation. I've never found any better way to get people to make a connection to the past than to have them on a battlefield and to move from the specifics of what we can see and what we can talk about on that ground and much larger questions such as what brought the armies here, you can do all kinds of things once you have someone making that connection. Most academic scholars would question the value of really immersing yourself in on-the-ground tactical details. They would argue that what's more important at Gettysburg, for example, is to discuss the political forces that sundered the Union and brought the armies to Gettysburg in the first place, how military events there and elsewhere affected other issues, such as I mentioned earlier, and how Americans later developed disparate memories of the battle. Some skeptical academics, and they're not uncommon, doubt the value of preserving battlefields at all. They see them as sites that glorify war and cater to what they see as a militaristic streak in American society. My effort to address controversial relationships between scholarly and popular concerns yielded analysis that clusters in several categories in this book. As a longtime bibliophile, drawn to books as both researching tools and collectible objects, I love books. I enjoy writing about notable titles and authors. I examined a number of essential published primary accounts, both Union and Confederate, military and civilian, famous and lesser known. I looked at historians such as David Potter and Alan Nevins, who, though their names have receded with the passage of time, produced works that remain absolutely pertinent in terms of their opinions and information. I also relished revisiting conventional interpretations in many of the essays, interpretations of both events and personalities, many of them almost universally accepted among non-specialists. In the essays as a group, I challenge, among other things, commonly held notions about Gettysburg and Vicksburg as decisive turning points, about U.S. Grant as a general who profligately wasted Union manpower, about the Gettysburg Address as a watershed that turned the war from a fight for Union into one for Union and emancipation, about Robert E. Lee as an old-fashioned general ill-suited to waging a modern mid-19th century war, and many others.
That's an interesting topic.
As I already mentioned, recent scholarly trends invite similar scrutiny. Are some of the recent trends, do they get us closer to getting at the heart of the war? Sometimes do they take us a distance away from the heart of the war? I'm not saying they're not important, but I'm saying that perhaps they're more ancillary than central. In my goal of alerting non-academic readers to the evolving nature of the field, possible topics of this kind came quickly to mind. I put them in the form of questions. Has a fascination with famous armies and generals obscured the importance of guerrilla operations? Some historians argue that guerrilla operations are the real military story in the war. Did the conflict end in 1865 or continue through Reconstruction and even beyond? How did the West, especially the area beyond the 100th meridian, figure in Union and Confederate planning and allocation of resources? Did emancipation join Union as an equivalent or even more important war aim for the mass of loyal soldiers and civilians in the United States? Should clashes between Indians and the U.S. Army and territorial units be considered part of the Civil War or elements of a much longer historical drama that unfolded between the late 18th century and the last third of the 19th century? Has the Eastern theater unfairly dominated the literature? And has the dark side of the war been slighted? These are the kinds of threads that I followed in these essays. Cultural manifestations of the war's continuing resonance figured in another group of essays. Hollywood's influence, always important, remains significant in shaping popular perceptions through films such as Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, which was released, as many of you know, in 2012. Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, initially aired in 1990 and was digitally restored for its 25th anniversary in 2015. It still reaches viewers during PBS fundraising efforts and on Netflix. Clashes over Confederate symbols are another cultural manifestation of the war's continuing influence. They've garnered headlines to a striking degree since the violence attending the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, I should say here in Charlottesville, Virginia on August 12th, 2017, and it picks up steam over the past several months, this conflict over the memorial landscape of the war. The tension between history and memory forms a theme throughout the essays and thus the book. All my classes and public presentations combine attention to both history and historical memory. I stress the importance of what actually happened, while also showing that successive generations remember historical events and personalities in sometimes starkly different ways. If someone doesn't grasp the difference between history and memory, they have a huge obstacle standing in the way of any kind of real historical understanding. Popular memory often trumps reality. It's what we think happened that guides how we react to what happened, and what we think happened might not even be close to what actually did happen. I emphasize this.
Should I turn off the sound here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm frozen on my screen. I hope I'm not frozen on all of yours. A good example of how history and memory often diverge, I'll use Gettysburg as an example again. It's the degree to which Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain has become, in some people's minds, the sort of central figure of the Battle of Gettysburg. He was not anywhere near that, of course. He did a great job on July 2nd. On the slopes of Little Round Top, but he certainly was not the central figure in the Union Army at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was no more important than David Ireland, the colonel of the 137th New York over on Culp's Hill. They did almost exactly the same thing on July 2nd, had almost exactly the same casualties. Nobody knows who David Ireland is. Everybody knows who Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is. I probably should pause here to make sure that is the audio still coming through from this? If the video isn't, my video is frozen.
Yes, Gary, we're hearing you great.
Okay, but the video is frozen. I'll just keep going. Many essays in the book touch on the shifting cultural and literary importance of four memory traditions created by the wartime generation. The generation that actually lived the war basically looked at it in four major ways. Two of these four sprang from the winning side. The Union cause celebrated above all else saving the Republic, created by the founding generation. The Emancipation cause, the second of the winning traditions, pronounced the end of slavery, the war's greatest achievement. Former Confederates offered their version of the war's origins and history in what we've all come to call the lost cause. And finally, the Reconciliation cause united some Americans, North and South, white Americans, in lauding the valor of white troops on both sides, muting the question of who was right and wrong, and cheering a united nation positioned by 1900 to take its place among the world's leading powers. An ability to detect the presence or absence of these four traditions assists any effort to chart the changing relationship between different groups of Americans and the Civil War. Films provide a rich target to identify memory traditions. We all know that. Films are wonderful that way. The Impact of the Birth of a Nation, 1915, and Of Gone with the Wind, 1939, in advancing the lost cause, or Of Glory, 1989, or Lincoln in 2012, in reminding filmgoers of the emancipation cause, cannot be overemphasized. A single film, even a really wretched one that almost no one sees, reaches far more people than what any historian has to say in a single book. A terrible film reaches far more people than even a really good book. So it's always important to pay attention to what Hollywood is doing. I hoped my essays would elicit considerable reaction from readers of Civil War times and thus allow me to hone arguments I presented in some of my books, such as The Union War or Becoming Confederates. I wanted to see how some of these ideas touch different people, and that in fact happened. Dana Schoaf published a sample of positive and negative responses in Civil War times as we went along, and he shared others with me privately. Both lay readers and scholars weighed in. My essay about Shelby Foote, for example, prompted divergent reactions. "I don't think I ever read such a mess before in my life," read one letter to the editor, which added, "I don't know who Gallagher is, nor do I care." The same essay inspired a positive reaction from another reader. "I think it's great when academic historians step back from their own work long enough to address the peanut gallery," he put that in quotation marks, "of critics who take issue with professional approaches to history." Two essays dealing with the war in the far western territories triggered a heated exchange to which I did not contribute. I'm not on Twitter. I loathe Twitter. Among scholars and others that began on Twitter and migrated to other social media. It was kind of fun to sit back and watch it, even if I didn't participate in it. Emails and letters sent directly to me by readers, many of them quite stridently approving or disapproving of what I've written, further indicated that many of the essays had touched sensitive nerves. In all of this writing for Civil War times, I had an opportunity to share my great enthusiasm for studying the war with an audience I knew held similar interests. My lifelong relationship with the Civil War era stems from the conflict's profusion of dramatic events, compelling personalities, unlikely political and social twists and turns, and engrossing military action. As a society and a people, Americans of the period grappled with elemental questions that continue to demand attention today. The questions don't get any larger. Would the Union forged by the revolutionary generation be scuttled because one part of the electorate didn't like the outcome of the presidential election of 1860? Would the institution of slavery, which had mocked the soaring language of the nation's founding documents, finally be eliminated? Would the relative power of the central government and the states and the localities be reoriented in a fundamental way? Would conflicts over reconstructing the Union undercut efforts to establish genuine social and political equality for Black people? And by far most important within international context, would the nation emerge intact and become an economic and military powerhouse? Confederate victory in the war something surely possible, though few Americans appreciate that fact now, would have altered the trajectory of the 20th century. Try to imagine World War II without the United States acting as an immensely powerful force, a force that not only sent its own huge military forces into the field, but also helped sustain the Soviet war effort, the British war effort. That would have been impossible if the Confederacy had established its independence during the American Civil War. I argue that only by coming to terms with the Civil War, as well as with how people have remembered it and used it in politics and popular culture, can anyone understand the broader arc of United States history. The war functioned as both an end and a beginning. It resolved huge issues left unresolved by the generation that won independence and wrote the Constitution, providing closure for long-term wrangling about slavery and the permanence of the Union. United States victory during the war, in turn, set the stage for economic and territorial expansion. Post-war Reconstruction, however, failed to prevent political and social strife relating to race, to the relationship between the central government and the states and localities, and to the meanings of U.S. citizenship that lingered for decades after Appomattox. Ongoing controversies over the Confederate memorial landscape constitute just one element of the war's long-standing power to affect the nation and its citizens. Barack Obama's election prompted some people in Texas to posture about secession. Donald Trump's election triggered the same kind of response in California. I'm always amused by talks about secession. I mean, really, secession, really? People are talking about secession in the 21st century? If the Civil War settled anything, it did settle that secession is not an option. Sadly, some school administrators, both public and private, support avoiding the Civil War because discussions about slavery, about massive bloodshed, and about a controversial memorial landscape, they argue, can cause discomfort among students and their parents. I say, bring on the discomfort. History makes people uncomfortable. Any real engagement with the past makes you uncomfortable. A free society has to confront its past, warts and all. The many sharp edges and troubling dimensions of the Civil War must be set against uplifting and empowering elements that help create a better version of the Founders' Republic. Many of you know that Joan and I put on seminars at the Huntington for 20 years. We put on a number of them. She and I have cooperated on any number of projects. We wrote a general history of the war called The American War together. It was Joan who first suggested that I take these essays from Civil War times and put them together in a book. We had many long conversations during which I considered how, taken as a group, the essays reflected my belief that narrative, chronology, biography are all essential to forging a true understanding of the past. Those are things that need to be used. These are unfashionable tools in some academic quarters today, where many people dismiss chronological frameworks as too simplistic or even contrived, too prone to favor narrative over analysis, too likely to bring individual personalities into play. But I've seen the confusion among students and others that too often results from purely thematic or theoretical approaches to history, most notably approaches devoid of human beings. Far too many students, even very bright ones, arrive in college with a hopeless muddle of information about American history and no real sense of how eras, movements, and events fit together. They need to learn that chronology not only matters, but it also provides an essential point of departure toward the goal of historical literacy. The bombardment of Fort Sumter followed the secession of the Lower South, which had occurred as a result of Abraham Lincoln's election. These episodes did not happen in that order by chance. Each proceeded from the earlier one. A large number of students over many years have expressed appreciation for my attention to chronology, often adding that it helped them see for the first time how and why events unfolded and connected with one another. A number of my essays also get at the relationship between political ideology and historical analysis. And I'll mention students again on this point. Most undergraduates enroll in classes to learn something about a subject, and they typically resent being held hostage to harangues regarding contemporary politics. I find this very encouraging. All historians have political views. I certainly do. All do. But we should strive to check them at the classroom door. For example, my voting choices have nothing to do with how I explain why men from New Hampshire or Wisconsin or Iowa, who faced absolutely no threat to their property and families from Confederate military forces, voluntarily donned blue uniforms and risked their lives to save the Union. If students could not account for such enlistments by the end of my class on the Civil War, I would have failed miserably. And injecting my own political views into the process would only get in the way. At the close of almost every semester, a few students would tell me that they couldn't tell whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat. Now that the semester is over, they would say, why don't you tell us? And I would always say no, because my politics have nothing to do with the class or my relationship with the students. Political ideology and passion too often dictate how historians and the public deal with certain elements of the past, and even how they determine what parts of the past even should be studied. This approach often encourages a simplistic division of dead historical actors into good people and bad people who should be treated accordingly. Nothing is easier than feeling superior to long dead individuals, almost none of whom satisfy our current ideas regarding race and other issues. Almost none of them. Even the radical Republicans, even the abolitionists don't. But the past is never simple. In fact, my 40 years and more of studying the Civil War has yielded one unequivocal truth. Namely, however complicated I imagined some episode or character to be, further research unmasked far greater complexity. I can't tell you how many times I thought I had a real handle on something. I've taught it a certain way for a long time. Then I did more research and realized that I had to change the way I was teaching it. It's vexing shades of gray rather than stark tones of black and white that usually await anyone who ventures honestly into the thickets of historical investigation. Letting ideology fuel an interpretation recalls lost cause writers who used selective evidence, airbrushed slavery and other negative elements of the Southern Rebellion, and came up with a shiny version of the Confederacy. Ideology can lead to pretending slavery-related issues were not central to the coming of the Civil War, or in our current world, conversely, to suggest the Union war effort had little or no meaning beyond its eventual embrace of emancipation. The essays in the enduring Civil War often angered readers who deplored what they considered my transgressions against their ideological preferences. Neo-Confederates scorned my placing slavery-related issues at the heart of secession and establishment of the Confederacy, or my refusal to concede that Nathan Bedford Forrest belongs alongside Lincoln as one of Shelby Foote's, quote, two authentic geniuses of the Civil War. To these people, I represent a typical Marxist communist professor, as several of them have put it, who hates the South. In contrast, my suggestion that Robert E. Lee possessed considerable military skill and wrestled painfully with multiple loyalties during the era of sectional controversy brought accusations of conservative special pleading on behalf of a slaveholder and traitor who should have been hanged. I have two files in my study. Here I am in my study, where I preserve such sentiments. The first one's labeled Hate Mail from Neo-Confederates. One correspondent, a South Carolinian who proudly signed his name, said he hoped I would develop, quote, a virulent form of pancreatic cancer. Jeez. Not a regular form, but a virulent one. And the second file, which is headed Hate Mail Calling Me a Neo-Confederate, includes accusations from the other side of this divide. All these messages remind me of advice from my graduate advisor that has guided much of my career. When I complained that recent research had forced me to change some of my prospective conclusions, my advisor, who was named Barnes F. Lathrop, curtly replied, and I'll quote him, "God damn it, Gallagher, just go where the evidence leads and you'll be all right." All the essays in the enduring Civil War reflect my attempt to honor Lathrop's advice. Whatever the fallout, when my observations diverged from prevailing orthodoxies. Because of the 1,000-word limit, the essays are suggestive rather than exhaustive. I hope readers will find them useful and provocative and enjoyable. And I think I've gone a little bit more, well, almost 40. I'm going to stop right now and open this up to however we're going to handle the question and answer part of this. Thanks for your attention. I see that there's still 85 people on board, or at least still logged on. So fire away.
All right. So, Gary, we do actually have one question in the chat area. I'm going to go ahead and read that. And then while we're doing that, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself, or you can post a question in the chat for Gary there as well.
Okay, there's the chat area. All right, there it is.
Okay, so there's a question from Steve Smith. Do you see that one there?
There's Steve Smith. Steve's in Tucson. Okay.
Would you like me to read it, or would you like to read it?
I'll read it. I don't know how. I was just trying to figure out how much to read. Thanks for inviting the Tucson Civil War Roundtable. Dr. Gallagher spoke on how numerous authors consider the Civil War to have, in a sense, lasted for many years past 1865, well into Reconstruction. A recent speaker at the Tucson Civil War Roundtable presented an overview on the pre-war Bleeding Kansas, Missouri situation during the late 1850s, and said he joined other historians that it can be argued that the Bleeding Kansas years were, in essence, the real start of the Civil War. Do you agree? No, I don't agree. Bleeding Kansas, which is the mid-1850s, was certainly a very difficult period. There was violence, there were people killed, there were paramilitary efforts on both sides there, but no one seceded because of Bleeding Kansas, and there was in fact a fairly quiet period for a while after Bleeding Kansas. I think we need to resist the temptation to just go from one sectional hotspot to another and see a direct line towards secession and war. There are a lot of other things going on in the 1850s other than these sectional controversies. There's a gold rush in California, for example, in 1858. In 1859, there's a national depression in 1857 that got a lot more attention in many places than what was going on relating to sectional controversies. I'm not denying that there was increasing sectionalism in the 50s. There certainly was, and temperatures were going up. But I don't think that what happened in Kansas and Missouri during the border troubles there in any way presaged an inevitable coming of the war.
And if you scroll down a little further, there's the question from Janet.
From Janet, okay. Given the North was more populous, the Union Army had more soldiers, the Union cause was victorious, how did the South's myth of the lost cause gain such a strong and enduring foothold in memory? Given that it was promoted by the vanquished South, was the North complicit in letting them down easy and allowing that myth to grow unchallenged? Yeah, this is a very complicated question, Janet, but I'll have a quick crack at it here. It's always struck me as quite remarkable how effective former Confederates were in getting their version of the war into the national discussion. It's certainly sectional through much of the immediate aftermath of the war in the 1870s and 1880s, but it becomes more national in the 1890s and then markedly more so in the early 20th century. And there are several things at work here, I think. One is the former Confederates played down slavery. This is one of the ways the lost cause absolutely is at odds with what actually happened. They weren't idiots. They knew that they were out of step with the rest of Western civilization in terms of their strong support for chattel slavery. And so retrospectively, they pretended that secession and the war weren't really about protecting slavery. Now, if you read what they said in 1861, there's no doubt that it's about slavery. They weren't embarrassed then. But retrospectively, they said it was a constitutional fight, state rights against an encroaching central government. And slavery was just one of the incidental things that was going on. So you can kind of push slavery out of the way, push emancipation out of the way. And as the 19th century went on, some white Southerners and some white Northerners said the real goal was to get the country back together. Let's reach across the bloody chasm. Let's have reunification that also has us really embracing one another. And so let's don't talk about why the war came. Let's talk about how brave Northerners and Southerners in the armies, white Northerners and white Southerners were, and we will have that kind of reunification. So it's reconciliation to a degree that's going on. The four memory traditions I mentioned, lost cause, Union War, emancipation cause, and reconciliation. Reconciliation and the lost cause come together very, very significantly and help the lost cause. The lost cause writers also emphasize Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a figure who appealed to many people in the United States. He was deeply religious. He didn't brag about himself. He was a good loser. They admired how he lost at Appomattox. He basically said, we tried, we lost, we now have to do what they say. The victors dictate the terms. That's what Lee did publicly. Publicly, he behaved impeccably. Privately, he loathed what was going on with Reconstruction. He raged against the radicals, but not publicly. Publicly, he said, accept the terms, get back together. And so you have a North that sort of forgives Robert E. Lee and, by extension, many of the Confederates as you go through the late 19th and early into the 20th century. And race certainly plays a role in it. White Northerners and white Southerners can agree about a lot of things relating to race. And the success of the movie Birth of a Nation in 1915 really underscores that, absolutely underscores the power of that. And that movie was incredibly influential. You cannot overstate how influential. It and Gone with the Wind, by far the two most important films relating to the Civil War in U.S. history. And they both present the lost cause version of both the war and Reconstruction. So it is... There's also an element to the lost cause argument, and I'll stop after this. The whole lost cause argument didn't make everything up. They argued that Lee was a great general. Lee was a great general. They argued the Confederates fought against long odds. The Confederates did fight against long odds. They argued that there are great victories won against the odds. That's true too. So there's some elements of the lost cause argument that were rooted in reality, but two of their main arguments, that slavery wasn't central, and then the other one, that they never could have won. That's the one I think that's had the most enduring influence on how people in the United States look at the war. Most people believe that the United States was destined to win the war. Confederacy never could have won the war. Didn't have enough of anything. That is central to the lost cause argument, absolutely central, and it just isn't true. And I don't have time to expand on that. That could be another talk. But the Confederacy certainly could have won independence, had a better chance of doing so against the United States than the colonists did against the British Empire during the American Revolution, I would say. Should I look for another question here? Let's see.
Next question there is from Lotta Ford.
Oh, there it is. Okay, wait a minute. Let's see. Share more details regarding the statement that Lincoln could not have been reelected without Atlanta. I'm happy to do that. The low point for the United States, anybody who argues that Gettysburg is the great turning point and Union victory was a sure thing after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, hasn't read anything about the summer of 1864. The great crisis for the United States came in the summer of 1864 when Lee was defending Richmond. Atlanta hadn't fallen, Richmond hadn't fallen, casualties in the Overland campaign were gigantic, even within a Civil War context, and morale in the loyal states drops to its low point in the war. Anti-war Democrats were riding high. They were arguing that it had become a war for emancipation when it should have been a war for union, and many people realized the Republican Party was really in trouble in the upcoming elections, including Abraham Lincoln, who told his cabinet in late August that the Republicans weren't going to be reelected and that they were going to have to win the war before the Democrats came in early 1865 because they knew the Democrats wouldn't win the war. What turned that around was the news of Atlanta. And then a little while later, Philip Sheridan's great victories in the Shenandoah Valley. Those two military successes for the United States completely changed public opinion in the United States, and the Republicans won huge victories. Those victories were much, much, much less likely before those victories at Atlanta and in the Shenandoah Valley. Now I'm going down again. Let's see. Kerry Hall, the next one, is that, let's see.
There is a question in there from Curtis Soto. And
all I see is, may I ask a question from Kurt?
Yeah, but if you scroll down, he actually is.
Well, there it is. There it is. There it is.
Just read it.
Let's see. No, that's the comment.
Well,
not a,
actually, he says he has a question about reconciliation. So I don't know.
Was the myth of the lost cause a matter of rationalization rather than reconciliation? Yes, I wish. I mean, this is. I feel like I'm painting the broadest strokes. The lost cause has lots of rationalizations. The former Confederates were in a bind. Here they had made one of the great gambles in U.S. history. They wanted to save the institution of slavery going forward, and which would have lasted a long time as it was. But then the actions they took killed it in 4 years, and it also killed at least a quarter of all their military-age white males, and maybe more than that, maybe more than 30%, depending on which number you accept. They lost slavery. They lost a huge amount of wealth and property and this terrible human cost. How are you going to walk away from that catastrophe with your head held high? Well, you need to have some kind of rationalizations, and one of them is it's not about slavery. It's about high constitutional principles. And we never could have won. There's no loss of honor in waging a war for high constitutional principles against a foe that has so much of everything that you never could have won. There's a lot of rationalizing going on there. Reconciliation was often what I would call situational reconciliation. You would speak in conciliatory terms when there was something you would gain out of it. I think most people retained a pretty hard edge of anger toward the other side, both on the U.S. side and on the Confederate side going forward, although reconciliationists often got the spotlight. And the war with Spain was a perfect chance to push reconciliation, because you had white Southern men and white Northern men all in blue uniforms, all fighting in Cuba or in the Philippines. They dusted off a number of former Confederate generals, the ones who'd been pretty young during the war, Joseph Wheeler, Fitzhugh Lee, and others, and made them U.S. generals. And people talked about that. Here we are, the nation's back together, sectionalism's behind us, and so forth. So there is real reconciliation going on, but there's also kind of situational reconciliation, and under the surface, a lot of great antipathy still toward the other side. Okay, now back up to
Kerry
Hall. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, Doctor. So many now are judging the past through the lens of today. By that measure, there's no person or civilization that can survive the cancel culture. What are your thoughts? Well, as I said earlier, nobody from the mid-19th century stands up to what we would expect of an enlightened set of views on race now. They just don't. People sort of gleefully discover that Abraham Lincoln said things. They discover that abolitionists did. Even someone like Benjamin Franklin Wade, the great radical from Ohio, one of the great radical Republicans during the war, they used racial epithets that are anathema to us now. Almost no one from the past meets our standards. And so if we're going to take our attitudes now and use them as the criteria to judge people from the past are always going to come up short, in my view. And nothing's easier than doing that. We're going to come up short in 30 years too when people look back at us. So I don't see any profit in that. At least not any profit in terms of really understanding. I think if we're looking at the mid-19th century, at white Americans in the mid-19th century, the baseline should be, by our standards, they're almost all racist. It's just the way it is. And so, okay, take that as a fact and move on to something more interesting. To me, the sort of miracle is that even in a society that had the racial views that the United States did in the mid-19th century, you get the Emancipation Proclamation. And then you get the 14th and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction, which would have been absolutely unthinkable without the Civil War. It shows what a great war can do in terms of unintended consequences. Giving the vote to African American men just a few years after the war, no one would have imagined that. I mean, most of the African American men could only vote in a handful of free states in 1816, mainly in New England. 5 of the 6 New England states allowed some degree of black suffrage. It's remarkable what the war brought in that regard. The Freedmen's Bureau things, I mean, things that would have been unthinkable earlier. But do they meet our standards? Of course they don't. Of course they don't. And I just grow weary of, you name a figure from the past and then somebody hammers them on this or that. I just, to me, it's boring, predictable, and doesn't really get us anywhere. Others disagree with me. Okay, any thoughts on areas, I'm going to Dave Schrader, is that any thoughts on areas of Civil War history that have not been sufficiently explored? God, it's a field that's so robust and is expanding so quickly. There are all kinds of things there are probably things that I couldn't even think of that haven't been sufficiently explored. I think one thing that hasn't been explored, there's been far more attention to the Confederate home front than to the Union home front. Far more attention to women in the Confederacy than to women in the United States during the war. Far more diaries of Confederate women published than diaries of Union women published. I would like to see more done with that. That's just one example. But I don't ever wake up in the morning worried that there's not going to be something new about the Civil War. Let's see.
Next one is from John Fearnow, if you scroll down just a
little
bit.
There he is. Okay, John. What actions in the West did you address in your essay? I talked about, there are actually 3 essays that deal with the West. And the one that really got me in trouble was the one where I argued that the trans-100th meridian West, in essence, had no effect on how the Civil War played out. And I absolutely stand by that. And that would include Henry Hopkins Sibley's campaign in New Mexico. I grew up in southern Colorado, and the nearest battlefield to me was Glorieta Pass, just outside Santa Fe. As a kid, I really wanted that to be important, but, it just wasn't. There were almost no troops involved there. The resources, if you want to see what the 2 governments think is important, where are they putting their resources? Well, where they're not putting them is in New Mexico or in Colorado or in Arizona. They're just not there. And I made that argument. I'm not saying we shouldn't study those things. I've read a lot about them, and I enjoy reading about them. They just didn't make any difference in how the war went. I think it's William Tecumseh Sherman. I mean, the one reason New Mexico and Arizona were important before the war, why they got a lot of attention before the war, is because slaveholders saw that area as the logical place to put a transcontinental railroad that had a southern termini. That's where they wanted. The reason we bought the Gadsden Purchase, of course, which includes modern-day Phoenix and Tucson, is because that included the land where the best railroad track would have gone. If you were going to be, and with Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War, he gave a lot of attention to that. After the war, not so much. One of the last 2 states to come into the Union until Hawaii and Alaska, New Mexico and Arizona. Not until the second decade of the 20th century. William Tecumseh Sherman in 1870 said, I have a good idea of what we should do with New Mexico and Arizona. Give them back to Mexico. They're never going to be of any use to the United States. They're just a drain on our resources. So that was what one of the essays was about. The other one was whether we should consider the conflicts with Native Americans during the Civil War as part of the war or part of something else. I argue they should be considered. They're not. What happened in Minnesota in August of the Dakota Sioux uprising in Minnesota, the Long Walk of the Navajo, they ended up at the Bosque Redondo in New Mexico, Sand Creek in eastern Colorado. I do not consider those Civil War events. They would have happened whether there had been a Civil War or not. They're part of a much longer trajectory that goes from the 17th century straight through the history of the United States and the and the English colonies before the United States, and they end at Wounded Knee at the end of the 19th century. They're not tied to the Civil War, and to me the best evidence of that is that people during the war rigorously separated, including the soldiers involved in them, rigorously separated what was going on against Native Americans and what was going on in this great war to suppress the rebellion. Okay.
And that's why it shouldn't.
There's Don Worth. Hello, Don. I haven't seen you in ages. How do you think attitudes are changing about the Civil War among succeeding generations? Those of us who are baby boomers got our fascination during the centennial. I'm one of those. Do you think interest is fading and succeeding generations are changing? Well, I think there's still a great deal of interest in the Civil War. My class is always filled in the Civil War. I taught my Civil War class at 8 in the morning at the University of Virginia, capped it at 150, and always filled it at 8 in the morning. Nobody gets up at 8 in the morning, but they would get up at 8 in the morning to read about, to hear about the Civil War and study the Civil War. I think visitation at National Park Service sites, visitation is down at all historic sites, but I think it's doing pretty well. I think that there's still significant interest in the American Civil War. I don't think it's quite as prominent as it was in the 1990s, where Ken Burns' series had an enormous impact on interest in that. That had more than any other thing in my lifetime in pushing interest in the war. But I do think there's still a strong interest in the war, and among young people and among people as old, Don, as you and I are, who cut our teeth during the Civil War centennial. In terms of attitudes toward the war, I still think that military events and kind of high politics are still the things people like to read about the most. They read biographies of Abraham Lincoln as fast as they can come out, multiple biographies of Sherman and Grant and Lee, and books on Gettysburg, and I mean, those are still the most popular things, although there's I think much more interest in the process of emancipation and in the African American side of the war, surely, than there was during the Civil War centennial. I think that's made its way into the more general interest in the war. Roy Atherton says, how significant was the Confederate influence in Southern California? Well, I'm talking to mainly Californians here. You all know as well as I do that Southern California, there was a lot of Southern sentiment in California, especially in Southern California. One of the first California senators was a slaveholder, as many in this audience know as well. I think Los Angeles probably would have voted, if anybody bothered to vote there, and there weren't that many people there, but they probably would have supported the Confederacy more than the United States. But was there a Confederate influence in California that really affected the state that much or amounted to any kind of real threat? Excuse me, I've got to take a drink.
Ray Starr.
I would say no, I don't think so.
I can go on that.
Okay, Gene Coughlin is the next one, is that right? Would I describe the Civil War as a culture war? And if so, do you see any similarities between the 1850s and today? Well, people at the time would have called it a cultural war. One of the great questions had the United States really turned into two different cultures by the time of the Civil War? And some people, and here is where I think perception is more important than reality. You can argue that either way. There are ways they're different, and most of those ways relate to slavery. The South grows these cash crops based on chattel slavery. The United States has more cities, it has more immigrants, it has far more industry, it has more banks. There are differences that way, but everybody speaks the same language. They're overwhelmingly Protestant Christians. They share a revolutionary heritage that they all absolutely cling to. There are powerful things holding them together. There are other ways they're different. But I think the real question is, did people think there were real cultural differences? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think they believed that they had developed. Northerners looked south and saw a lazy, brutal people who relied on slavery. They believed democracy didn't really thrive in the South. That wasn't true. But they believed that. They didn't believe white Southerners were really small d Democrats. They believed oligarchs ran the South. The South looked north and saw money-hungry, cold, grasping people who didn't care about family, who didn't really care about religion, who only cared about making money. Some of these stereotypes are you still see them today. White Southerners are all sort of dumb hicks. Northerners are all interested in money. So I think culturally, people at the time did believe that there were real differences. I'm not one who thinks we're on the verge of another civil war now, although we're certainly divided now. And there are certainly, one thing that's similar now to what was going on in the 1850s is that there are a lot of people whose first impulse is to think the worst about someone they don't agree with, rather than really wanting to get in a genuine discussion or argument. They just assume the worst and demonize the other side. There is a lot of that going on now, a great deal. As someone who lived through the 60s, I'm not sure it's worse than it was in the 60s. I know violence now is not anything like it was in the late 60s, but it's bad now, but it's not like it was. I mean, the Civil War, we're not in the midst of anything like the actual Civil War now. Let's see. Okay, Kurt DeSoto, if the Confederacy's been able to get the gold and silver from the mines in the West, wouldn't that have changed pouring in Buff species was, okay, would all that gold and silver from the West have helped the Confederacy? They would have liked to have the gold and silver. Of course they would. The notion that they were going to conquer these areas and go from Colorado to California with what? The Sibley's campaign had 2,500 men. It's one brigade. He called it an army. It's a brigade. That is such a pipe dream, a preposterous pipe dream. Nobody at the time was really talking about that. A few of them talked about it after the war, but there's just really, the war is going to be decided back where the war is decided. That's mainly east of the Mississippi River, although some important campaigns happened on the near part of the Trans-Mississippi in Arkansas and Louisiana and Missouri. But when you get farther west, it just isn't, just not there. Finally, I'll make this the last one. Would you consider John Brown's raid the event that augured? Okay, that's another one. No, I don't think John Brown's raid, again, John Brown's raid is one of these incidents that highlights how volatile the sectional issues could be. But John Brown's raid is in October of 1859, and Fort Sumter is in April of 1861. It's a long time from John Brown's raid to the firing on Fort Sumter, and the Republicans in 1860 specifically disavowed John Brown. I mean, you don't have a Republican Party that's on board with John Brown. John Brown represents a tiny percentage of the white populace of the United States, really, really tiny. He doesn't really, he's not representative of anybody, really. He's a true radical, and such a radical that even someone, I mean, Frederick Douglass looked at him and said, you know, John Brown made him feel embarrassed. John Brown actually did things that some people talked about. John Brown did them. Okay, now here's, what's your favorite book on the Civil War? One you'd like to read again and again. I'll tell you what I'm doing right now, and I could reach, well, I'm not going to walk over there. The Library of America is going to issue one of their very nice one-volume editions of the trilogy that Bruce Catton wrote on the Army of the Potomac, Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and Assistance and Appomattox. I've been immersed, and I'm going to write the introduction and do the editing for it. I've gone back to Catton. I started off with Catton as a young kid, 1961, 62. I read Bruce Catton. I've gone back to Catton, and Catton is just a marvel to me, just an absolute marvel. And I get such enjoyment from reading his stuff. It holds up exceedingly well. Written in 1950, 51. Here we are 70 years later, and those books still hold up. The book that was the most important to me in getting me interested in the Civil War had a text by Bruce Catton. It was the American Heritage Picture History of the Civil War, which came out in 1960. I see this. Kurt DeSoto says, Catton was a founder of our roundtable. Well, that's a good person to have among your founders. He was a founder of my interest in the Civil War, too. I will say thank you for, there are still 77 of you hanging on after all of this. It's 11:27 in Charlottesville, and I am going to bid you good night. Thank you for the invitation again, and I look forward to speaking to you in person on your home ground again in the future. Good night.
Professor Gallagher, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. I know that it's late for you, and we really appreciate the effort that you made to be able to be with us here this evening. Thank you so much again, and this is the best turnout that we've had. Obviously the best turnout for 2021, but I think it's also the best turnout that we've had since we've had any of the virtual sessions. So thank you for bringing that to us, and we hope that it will inspire others to be able to continue to attend for future sessions. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Mind blown.